As we mark Women's Day in South Africa, we're also taking a look at the representation of women in the media. Now, a South Africa-based non-profit company called Quote This Woman has curated a database of female experts in Africa for journalists. The aim of the platform is to contribute to gender transformation in the media landscape through the use of female voices and narratives. Joining us this morning is the founder and director of Quote This Woman, Kath Magrobi. Let me thank you for your time this morning. It's so great to talk to you. And, you know, you've now pointed out what all of us feel, especially when we work in the media, that there is this real lack of women voices, women expert voices in several fields across the landscape. Tell us about some of those numbers, not only in South Africa, but on the continent, insofar as representation of the people seen and heard.
Thanks, and happy Women's Day to you. Yes, Michelle, absolutely. So in South Africa, in fact, actually, what's interesting is that South Africa is not very different from the rest of Africa or the rest of the world, in that 4 out of 5 voices that are heard making news stories will be men's voices. Wow. Wherever you are, pretty much anywhere. And interestingly, at times of elections, during wars, that increases to 7 to 8 voices being men's voices. Sorry, let me rather say 7 in 8 voices being men's voices. So we've got a long way to go before we start to close that gender gap and get equal representation. And that's what Quote This Woman does, is curate a database that allows journalists to have a different place to go to find sources for their news stories. Yeah.
What a fantastic initiative, and I feel like our colleagues across the media landscape are going to be using you a lot more after this interview. But you know, the numbers that you've given us, Kath, the 4 out of 5 and the 7 out of 8, what does it come down to? Does it come down to laziness on the part of media practitioners in finding those voices?
Yeah, that's a nuanced question, and in this amount of time, I don't think we can go into it in enough depth. Michelle, I don't need to tell you that the media has been going through a seismic change before COVID and since COVID. So a lot of it has to do with the hemorrhaging of newsrooms. You know, there isn't, in many newsrooms, there isn't that full-time, dedicated news editor plus deputy news editor who between them can collate that little black book of really good experts that young journalists can come into and say, who can I quote on this and that, that have managed to reflect the change in the slow dismantling of the patriarchy in any way. So everyone's just left to fend for themselves, and it's just so much easier to reach out to the voice that is loudest and the voice that wants to be heard, which often is the well-educated, cisgender, heterosexual white man, if I can put it so bluntly. You know, the voice that speaks the loudest is the voice that tends to just garner the most attraction. So that's on the one side. But on the other side, it is true that there are so many reasons why women co-construct and internalize barriers to putting themselves forward as voices. You know, society doesn't encourage women to speak up, and the media just reflects so many of the power structures. So it's not surprising that journalists don't necessarily look for women's voices. So we're just trying to make it really easy for journalists to find those voices. And let me just say, journalists are really interested. We haven't found a single newsroom that isn't really interested in using our database.
And in fact, are out there actively looking for women voices, and particularly the voices of black women. You know, you talk about the missing sort of leadership structures in newsrooms, given the shifts that we've all gone through under COVID-19. There's also that part of institutional knowledge that we've lost in undergoing those seismic shifts.
100%. 100%. And for that reason, Quote This Woman is filling an important gap, and I think newsrooms appreciate that. We are a huge source for journalists, and especially young journalists, who are able to find really good sources really easily. And the fact that there are women sources serves our agenda and is helping to close that gender gap.
Gav, you've talked about the typical voice that we see out there on any given news day, but in particular, perhaps, as you say, when it's at election time or when wars are erupting, and it's the typical white man that's more represented than perhaps any other thought leader, shall we say, in the media landscape. I want to sort of look at the other side of the coin. Can we as black women also be to blame in some way for not putting ourselves forward as much as cisgender white men do? Can we take part of that blame?
I don't think so. You know, I would be very reluctant to say that. You know, there's been so much research that just says that women don't get the mentoring that men get from early on in their careers. Our entire society is structured still in such a way that penalizes women, you know, from childhood, that says don't be loud, don't put yourself forward, don't step into the spotlight, don't beat your own drum. So Quote This Woman does a lot of media training for women that actually looks at the inner work that it takes to own your voice and stand in the spotlight. And believe me, Michelle, it's not just about learning media skills about what makeup to wear and what colors are right and what are your key messages. It's really about inner work, about deconstructing messaging that you've had since childhood about not being too much. So honestly, I don't think that would be fair. And add on to that all of the unpaid work that women do, not only in the home, but even in the office. You know, who takes the sour milk out of the office fridge and washes the last 3 dishes that have been left in the kitchen and unjams the printer you know, women just pick up the unpaid labor in so many ways. It's just really drummed into us. And so 1,000 reasons why women will say, you know, please don't ask me to speak to a journalist as well. I just don't have time. I have too much else that I'm taking on in my life. So honestly, when women step forward, they're being superheroes. What we often say when we do journalist training as Quote This Woman is please don't expect women experts to respond as quickly as men. Understand that society needs to shift far before we dismantle patriarchy and start to make allowances for the fact that we have a complex society that we're still working with. So there's work that needs to be done on both sides in order to close that gender gap.
I think I might have a neck injury after this interview because I'm nodding so vehemently as you're speaking. It all rings so true to me, and I'm sure for the women listening as well, because where men are confident and outspoken, women are brash and abrasive, right?
Isn't it just so terrible? So terrible. Yeah. And I have to say, so Quote This Woman's had to really develop a kind of niche media training for that in order to encourage women to join our database. You know, when I started Quote This Woman, I thought that journalists were a whole lot of like arrogant so-and-sos who didn't want to interview women, and that would be thousands of women just dying to join Quote This Woman's database. And it was exactly the opposite. Journalists were so keen to embrace the concept, and it was women who weren't stepping forward, not because they didn't want to, but because they just didn't have the resources.
Yeah.
So we had to develop a kind of media training that came through a very intersectional feminist lens, and that's actually quite unique as far as we know anywhere in the world, that really looks at the inner work taken to construct a kind of agency that helps women earn the spotlight and step up to the mic.
And the sort of positive offshoots of this are just too many to mention, right? Including broadening the pool of experts and sources, that we use in the media. Getting a wider range of opinion and analysis on important events that are shaping our own media landscape, are shaping our country as well. One of the other offshoots is that, black girl children get to see people who look like themselves doing this incredibly important work as well.
So, one of the basic principles that Quote This Woman is founded on is that women experience life differently from men. And if that difference doesn't come through in the nuance and complexity of news stories, then the world isn't being portrayed properly in the media. When women's voices are absent, then the issues affecting women don't come forward in media stories, and they don't come to the tables of influence, and the media has so much influence. And that's just so important.
Yeah, it just can't be overstated. Kat Magrobi, it's been such a great pleasure talking to you this morning, especially given that it is Women's Day. The founder and director of Quote This Woman. Kat, thanks very much indeed for joining us.